It was a couple Saturdays ago. I found a video from a guy who's been programming since the 1980s, and he does classes and books. And what he was saying was in his video was very interesting. He was talking about how from time to time his students will ask him, well, why don't you give us programming exercises to do? And he gave a very short answer, which I did happen to agree with. He said, well, basically because these programming exercises are a waste of time. And he said, these are very common in college and university. Here in the United States, we just generally call it college. But when you're in college and you're taking programming classes, they like giving you these programming exercises because, well, for the most part, they're very easy to grade. If you were to give somebody a big project to do that might take an entire semester, that would probably require much more effort in grading than just something that is a simple coding exercise on a test. So his big premise was, and I happen to agree with the basic premise of what he was saying, which is pick a project and start coding that instead. Now, just a couple of days ago on Reddit, there was a guy who made a post, which again I agreed with, and I'm going to read this to you here, and I'll interject my own commentary in here, which was the title of this was Just Write Programs. And he said in here, okay, how do I learn blank? In other words, C++ or Java, Python, whatever. Write programs. I don't understand blank. Write programs. How do some of you know so much? Well, by writing programs. And he goes on to say it's literally that simple. There's no magic method that experienced programmers found. Grab some documentation, write down an idea, avoid tutorials if you can. Although I will interject here, I don't necessarily have a problem with tutorials. I mean, how would I? I post them here on YouTube from time to time. The big thing about tutorials is that they are building blocks. In other words, when you see a tutorial that shows you, for instance, how to get started with PySide, that is a basic entry point to get you started. It's not the end all to be all. Only by doing a bigger project are you going to have something that you can really sink your teeth into. So he says use them, tutorials, to give you a baseline so you can start making your own stuff and just start programming something. It doesn't have to be good, but if it has to be something that works. Hell, even the working part isn't a requirement if you learn something, because something is better than nothing at all. Now this part I actually do not agree with. I think that if you do pick a project that interests you and you want to start doing a coding project in it, one of the biggest requirements of that is that it should work. So I always tell people start on a baseline of it must work. So I've talked about rules of computer programming here before. And number one, it must work. Number two, it must be maintainable. And then you can start worrying about things like efficiency. Okay, getting back to this post. A lot of you are overcomplicating the hell out of learning your tech stack. It doesn't matter what someone has told you, because it all boils down to just writing more code. And I would say this slightly differently. I would agree with it doesn't matter what someone has told you, but just writing more code to me is not enough. What you really need to do is you need to pick a project that you want to work on and focus on writing that code. He goes on to say, yes, you're going to feel stupid. Yeah, that does happen. Yes, you're going to feel overwhelmed. That can happen too. Yes, you're going to think that it takes a genius to learn this stuff. Now, I can tell you from personal experience, I have worked with a lot of coders who I would not classify as geniuses, but they do write good code. So, no, you do not have to be a genius to be a really good programmer. You just need the experience. He goes on to say these feelings are normal. Don't get involved, and I really agree with this. Don't get involved in stupid IDE versus text editor or language versus language wars. And I'm going to say more about this when I read you the next article here. Just focus on making simple projects. The knowledge will come. Don't overcomplicate it, just write code. Now, like I said, I agree with this post for the most part. I think that once you have gotten yourself started with, maybe a textbook, YouTube tutorials, once you get to the point where you want to start building something, sit down and start building it. Just practice with it. Yeah, you are going to make mistakes, and I've made loads of mistakes. Even when I started with PySide, I did things incorrectly for a while. But after a while, you figure out what's correct and what isn't, and that comes from experience, and that requires actually writing code. Okay, now the next article I want to talk about goes hand in hand with this, and this was posted, I believe, yesterday. So this guy says, I need a big project that I can start with little knowledge. So I've got some things to say about this because I feel this guy's pain, but I also want to interject a few things in here. So he goes on to say, basically, I've been trying to learn programming, specifically C++, since a while now. But I'm really struggling with motivation, which results in me programming for a month, stopping for like 5 months, and forget everything. I think he means to say, and I forget everything. That's why I think I need a huge project that would take me a very long time to finish and would give me good knowledge. I have a bit of knowledge about everything, so I don't really have an issue learning new stuff. I wanted to start building an OS, but apparently it's like the end game of programming and not really recommended. Any idea on what I should go for? Thanks. Okay, I've got some problems with this. Number one is, if you have to post on the internet about what project should you do, the problem that's going to happen is that you're going to get hundreds of different answers to this, and it's quite possible that absolutely none of them interest you. What I always tell people is, let's say you're just working at home, you're not a programmer by profession, maybe you don't even work in IT, but you do have a high technical mind and you really want to start getting into programming, you should pick a project that interests you, not something that the community recommends to you. I do agree with what this guy said about, starting to build an OS. Apparently it's like the end game of programming and not really recommended. There is something to say about project scale. In other words, if you're going to pick a project, maybe you don't want to pick a project that's so ambitious, like building an operating system. There is nothing wrong with picking a small project, working on that to completion, and then maybe stepping yourself up into something a little bit bigger. So, for instance, PySide, one of the most common basic applications that I see people make is either a calculator application. I see this with tkinter all the time. I don't know why, but there seems to be a lot of calculators that get made with tkinter. Maybe it's just the tutorials that I have seen. The other thing is a notepad application, where somebody will say, or they'll just pick a notepad. I'm going to do something I already know. I know what one should look like, which isn't a bad idea, and I'll get that to completion. And then what you can do with a notepad app is you can move on from the basics to maybe adding some search capability into it. So what you're going to have is a mix of writing a brand new app and then having to go back and maintain that app by inserting other functionality. Again, not a bad thing. I don't disagree with that at all. So I do agree that sometimes you have to look at project scale, and maybe you don't want to start off with something so big. But once you get past a simple notepad app, I think you should really sit down and look at what really interests you and say, well, what application could I do that fits inside that space? The other the other problem I have with posting these types of questions on the internet is inevitably what happens, and this really ticks me off, but what inevitably happens is you're going to find somebody out there who is going to tell you, don't reinvent the wheel. So if you post online like this and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing a calculator app, somebody's going to come along, and I personally guarantee it, somebody's going to come along and say, well, that's already been done 1,000 times. Why are you reinventing the wheel? Well, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, reinventing the wheel when you're doing it for the learning experience isn't a bad thing. Yes, there's a whole bunch of notepad applications out there. There's a whole bunch of calculators. There's a whole bunch of media players. There's this, there's that, there's the other thing. That doesn't mean that you taking the time to reinvent it and go back is going to be a bad thing. It's not. It's all part of the huge learning experience. Then maybe you transitioned into something that really interests you. I'm going to give you two case scenarios that in my life I have gone back and I have reinvented the wheel. The first one comes just last week. So I run a Minecraft Bedrock server here at home for myself. And when I started doing this years ago, I found a set of shell scripts that provided some well-needed functionality. Number one was the Bedrock server does not go out and check for updates automatically. You have to do that manually. And one of the shell scripts would go out and check to see if there's a new version of the Bedrock server. It would pull it down, and then it would unzip it for you. The other thing that the script did was it made a backup of your worlds folder. Now, what always ticked me off about this, well, number one, I don't like shell scripts. I have never liked shell scripts. And quite frankly, these were big and ugly shell scripts. So I was always angry about that. Maintaining them was always a pain. Everything was hard coded inside these scripts. So when I first got them, I had to spend time editing them just to even get them to work. And then last week, or the end of the week before, I can't remember which, but they broke because the URLs for checking for the new version of the server had changed. When that happened, I fixed the script, but I sat back and said, you know, I'm sick of this. I don't like these. I'm going to write a couple of Python programs that replace all of this functionality. And that's what I did. I wrote two Python programs. One goes out there and checks for the server update, pulls it down, installs it. And the second one does the world backups for me. Now, yes, I reinvented the wheel because I already had something that worked. I could have changed it. But here's the thing. I didn't like it. I didn't like the way it worked, and I didn't like all the hard coding, and I didn't like how hard it was to maintain. I removed all the hard coding. Everything is now in a database table. So I just use that, look up the setting I need, like where to download the updates to. And now anytime I need to make a change, all I have to do is edit that database table. I don't have to go into the code at all. So I removed all the hard coding. It's much easier to maintain now in Python. Like I said, I'm not a huge fan of shell scripts. Sorry, shell script fans out there. I'm just not one of your people. So now what I have is what I like. Okay? And that goes to the point of why reinvent the wheel? Well, let's say you're driving a car. Let's stick with the wheel analogy. You're driving a car. You want to replace one of your wheels. Somebody hands you a wheel from a tractor. Tractor tires can be over 8 feet tall. Are you really going to put that on your car? No, of course not, because there's no way it's going to fit. You're not building a mud buggy. You're trying to put a new wheel on your passenger car. So that's going to cause a problem. And that's one of my points of reinventing the wheel is if it doesn't fit your needs, create your own wheel. Now, my second example is a long example because this has been going on now for many years. Back in the early 2000s, I was keeping track of my personal finances basically in a ledger book. I would sit there and I would write in a ledger book. And finally, I got tired of that, and I said, I really want to do this electronically, but I don't want to have to rely on something like Excel spreadsheets. Wonder if I can find something that'll help me do this, with software. I looked around for a while, and I finally found something called Personal Finance Journal from a company called Omni High Tech in Canada. Did the trial. It had like a 30-day trial, and I liked the software. It was extremely simple, which is what I was looking for. I wasn't looking for something. The other ones I found were complex. I didn't like how they looked. I didn't like how they felt. I didn't like the usage. I tend to be extremely picky with software, and I don't like settling or compromising with it. Now, it was $10, so I flipped him the $10 many years ago and was using the software. As inevitably happens in life, things change. And this is no different. So what happened is two basic things. Number one, in 2008, the company went out of business. Now, that meant I wasn't going to get any updates to the software. In fact, I think I'd put on several updates by this time. I had the latest version. I had a license key. So no real reason to change. But the company going out of business made me sit and think if I shouldn't take and think about creating my own. I didn't have as much programming experience back then as I do today, and so it was a bit of a daunting task for me to replace it, but I thought, maybe at some point in time I'll take and replace this software. So then, the second thing that happened was that I got a new personal laptop, and the new personal laptop had Windows 7 and not Windows XP. So this shows you how long ago this was. When I upgraded to Windows 7, the software stopped working completely. And I was like, well, great, it won't launch. So now what am I going to do? Well, in the interim, what I did was I kept my T60 ThinkPad that was running XP, and I just ran it on that. No big deal. The only two complaints I really had about this software, which is why I kept jumping through hoops to run it, but I had two major complaints. One is the reporting inside of it was pretty poor, and the other thing was you could not save attachments to transactions. And I really wanted to do that. I wanted to put an attachment like PDFs and scanned documents and things in with the transactions. I just couldn't do that with this software. So I thought it'd kind of be nice if I could do that. Maybe I could do that myself. I investigated what technologies to do this in, but eventually I had to put the project up on the shelf. So I just kept using it in Windows XP. Later on, I went to create Windows XP virtual machines, ran it in there for many years. Then 4 or 5 years ago, I think it's like 5 years ago now, I actually started getting into Python. And that was a necessity due to work. And one of the first questions I thought of is, I wonder if I can do graphical applications with Python. Turns out you could. I settled with PyQt at the time. I've since migrated to PySide. And then finally, I could sit and write my own application. So yes, I reinvented the wheel. I have looked at alternatives to Personal Finance Journal over the years. Don't like any of them. Sorry, folks. I don't like the wheels that you're handing me. So when you're a programmer, what you do is you write your own wheel. And that's what I did. And that's what I think that you should do. I think that you should be completely and totally unafraid to write your own wheel. So, again, the coding exercises are okay. The tutorials are great. They're going to get you to a certain point. But then what you really need to do is you really need to write an application. You need to pick an idea and write an app. There's a big world of difference between writing a complex application to doing these simple coding tutorials and coding exercises. Again, good to get started, but then pick a project and go with it. And the other thing I would recommend that you do is keep it to yourself. Maybe you need help with the project and ask for help, that's fine, but I wouldn't announce to the world on the internet what you're going to do. I wouldn't ask them what projects to do. You're going to get 1,000 different answers. You're probably not going to like any of it. And if you can't find anything that you really want to write, then I would step back from this for a while until you come up with a project that you want to do yourself. Something that's more meaningful than just the tutorials or the coding exercises. If you can't think of something, then why are you doing this in the first place? Okay? I don't want to sound rude by saying that, but you learn a lot more from doing the big projects than you're ever going to do from the coding exercises. Make sense? I think so. I've got 24 years of experience, so I do know a thing or two. Anyway, I hope you're having a great day. Hope the rest of your week is good. And other than that, happy coding.